So right now we're going to talk about Apple's big announcement moving away from Intel to silicon processors. And what does this mean for you? What does this mean for you as a creative professional? What does it mean for you as someone who uses hardware? And also, what does this mean for you for someone who uses software? Should you update a computer? Should you not? I'm going to simplify this and answer a lot of your questions right now. But I also imagine I'm also going to pose a few new questions in this quick discussion. Hey Cafe crew, it's Colin Smith here from photoshopCAFE.com. And so like many of you, I watched the Apple keynote and I actually went back, I took some notes and I looked at some things, and I wasn't going to make a video about this, but I got a lot of questions from you guys, like a ton on our YouTube and on our social media. And also I noticed that some of the tech tubers are not really covering this, they're just kind of skimming over it, maybe because they don't really understand what it means or they haven't been through it before. But having been through a couple of the major Mac transitions and some of the Windows ones, of course, particularly going from PowerC into the Intel chip, going through OS 9 to the OS 10 Aqua transition. So I've seen things like Universal Binary before, we've seen things like Rosetta before, and the hardware shift. So we're going to go through all of this right now. So the first thing I really want to let's just address the elephant in the room. Should you buy a new computer? So essentially what's going to happen is there's going to be two systems going forward. Right now, Apple have been using Intel processors for a while. They used to use PowerPC. They switched to Intel 10 years ago. I was actually there and Steve Jobs did the announcement. I've got a picture there that I took when I was at Macworld. And so what that did is it opened up a new world for Apple. Apple was kind of known as a walled garden or very proprietary. Moving to Intel, what it did is it made Apple more universal. So essentially using the same hardware architecture that Windows PCs were using. And that's why we saw the rise of things like Hackintosh or people buying Mac hardware running only Windows on it. So going to that Intel-based chip means that you could run Windows natively, which also meant unprecedented compatibility between Windows and Apple. You used to have to install programs to even move a Word document between one to the other. But then once it went to Intel, everything became unified. It kind of opened up Apple in a lot of ways. And I also believe that was part of Apple's explosive growth. So now Apple's wanting to go back to that walled garden, but they do have their reasons. And before I move into that, I just want to let you know I use both Windows and I use Mac. So I'm not a Mac fanboy and I'm not a Mac hater. I have the latest Mac Pro and I also have the latest MacBook Pro, as you can see here, plus I have a Windows machine. So let's just get that out of the way. So let's first of all look at what does this mean. So what that means is Apple is leaving the Intel system and they're going to start to build some computers based on their own chips. Now, these are not new chips, pie in the sky. These are the same chips that they've developed over the last decade, starting with the iPhone and then moving into the iPad. So they stated the big advantage, of course, is performance per watt. So, back in the day when they invented the iPhone, no one had a smartphone. BlackBerry was the closest thing to it, but it didn't have a full display. So they had to invent a chip that would run basically a full computer with a GPU and everything, but it would run at very, very low power consumption. So this is something that Apple's got really good at. And if we look at the last couple of years, we've had issues with the MacBook Pro. In fact, I got the new 16-inch MacBook Pro. I love it. But the previous model, which is the one right in front of me, was kind of known as having thermal gate. Thermal gate meant that the processors can't run at full speed because of the form factor of the computer and the cooling. So the chips are essentially running hotter. And so in order to cool down those chips, they have to slow down the speed of the computer, which means that, of course, the computer is not running it fast or taking full advantage of it. Other things is battery life, all these kind of things. So I can see the advantages in Apple doing this, and we'll talk about the disadvantages in a second. So the advantages are that Apple can use the same chipsets that they've taken from the iPhone into the iPad that they've developed and then put them into the laptop. So I can tell you for the MacBooks, MacBook Pros, it's definitely going to be, I think, incredibly game-changing because we're going to see a lot of power. We might even see them get even smaller and lighter, and they're going to be running cooler and the batteries are going to last longer. The other advantage, of course, is that they're all going to be running on the same system. So this new Apple Silicon is going to be the chip, So the software that's going to be running on there is going to be fully compatible with what's running on your iPhone, on your iPad. So essentially, they're all going to be running on the same system. Another advantage of that, mobile apps, iPhone apps and iPad apps will work natively on your desktop. Perhaps your desktop apps will also work on your mobile devices. Who knows? Okay, so now let's look at the gotcha, or the big gotcha that comes to this. And that's SoC, or SOCs, SOCS. What does that essentially mean? It means system on a chip. So this is what they're doing inside the phone and in the iPad. So essentially, a system on a chip is an enclosed system. So it means they have one chip that contains everything. Rather than having a motherboard, which is the traditional way that most computers work, is we have a motherboard, we put on a CPU, which is the central processing unit, we put on the RAM, which is the memory, we strap on a GPU, or we plug in a GPU, which is our video card, we put an I/O card in, which is your in-out, where you can put, USB ports, all these different things. And so all these different things are attached to the motherboard. The advantage of that, we can upgrade RAM, we can upgrade GPUs, we can upgrade CPUs, and everything is upgradable, and you can switch it out as much as you want. The disadvantage of that, well, it's a sealed unit, just like we get on an iPhone or an iPad. So I think this is the direction we're going. So it does have its advantages because everything's in one place. It has the advantage in being able to run faster, more efficient, cooler. There's less buses and things in there, and there's less intermediate things that are using power or slowing down performance. So when you build everything into one chip, it can be much smaller, it can run much faster, and it can be much more power efficient. Now, you know where I'm going with the downside of that. Yeah. You can't upgrade yourself or expand it or do these kind of things. So, before we speculate too far, so we know that they didn't just say a chip. They said an SoC, but that means they're definitely going to be doing that. So the first thing is, what's going to be going away? Is it going to be RAM? Are we just going to have a certain amount of RAM on there, or you can buy a different package? I imagine it's probably going to be different packages. So you're going to essentially get, the low, medium, maybe they'll call it the Air package, the Mac package, and the Pro package. I would imagine with the Pro package, they would allow expandability. So some of the SoCs will allow external RAM. So we could have everything built into the one chip. And then maybe when you're running mobile on a laptop or something like that, it's running on there. And then when you plug it in, you could be using eGPU technology, which is another graphics processor. So it's possible on the Mac Pro, for example, we could still be using external RAM and GPUs. But I see it very, very unlikely on the laptops in the far term that's going to happen. I think maybe kind of like what we have right now. There's two graphics processors, by the way, built into the machine I have here right now and most of your machines. There's what's called integrated graphics, which is on the Intel chip, which runs the graphics. So when you unplug your machine and you have it on low power consumption, it's running on that. So it's using minimum power. It can run your graphics and do all those kinds of things. Now, if you want to edit video, do heavy duty work with the GPU, you plug it in, and then it goes to the secondary Radeon GPU, which is in here, and starts to use that. So I can imagine with the MacBook Pros, maybe they'll keep the GPU for a while, but I can definitely see end of day with that, and also the iMacs and iMac Pro. The other advantage, of course, they're going to get these things even thinner because this is holding up space. We got to use a bigger battery than what's necessary. So then it brings the other question of so what's going to happen with the Mac Pros? Okay. Before I get ahead of myself, we'll talk about that in a sec. Let's talk about how this is going to work as far as the software. So we're basically heading to this 2-lane highway for a little bit of time. We've been here before a couple of times. It's certainly not the first time for me. And so essentially, this is what happens. So right now, you've got your machine running on your Intel, which means all the software, everything that you know right now is based on this. And going forward, as long as you stay on this, you don't really have to worry about anything. It'll keep working. They said that the transition is going to take 2 years, and they're going to support Intel for several more years going forward. But that means eventually you're going to get that notification. This new operating system is going to come out and they're going to say, hey, you know what? Doesn't support Intel anymore. That hard wall is there. Even though we don't see it, it's there somewhere down the road. So you have to consider that. Now, most of us won't get to that wall because there's just too many juicy, tempting carrots along the way. And so I remember previously, working on the older machine and then seeing the new software coming out. And then you'll start to see features that will only be working on Apple Silicon. And that's the name they've given us right now. So we'll go for Apple Silicon for now. So that's PowerPC, Intel, Apple Silicon. This is what they call the fourth big jump in Apple technology. The first one was PowerPC. The second one was OS 10, or some people call it OS X. The third one was going to Intel. This is going to be as big a transition. And that's why if you look at the operating system, Big Sur, it's not iOS 10 point whatever. It's iOS 11. And a lot of people mistakenly say ISX. It was actually iOS 9 before that. X stands for 10. It's a Roman numeral. So we've been there for 10 years. And now we're going to 11. So this is a bigger deal than you realize. So we're seeing these things built in. So there's a couple of things that are being built in here that are not really going to make any difference to you as long as you're running your Intel machine. You're not going to notice, except for some newer software is going to start to appear on the other side of that wall. And that grass is going to start to look greener and greener. And developers are going to slowly stop dropping new features into the old version. They're going to do update patches just to keep things running, service packs, things like that. And all the new features are going to start to get built into the Silicon product, because it's just not feasible for software developers like Adobe or other companies to fully maintain two systems. Yes, they talked about universal, and that's not new either. The universal binary, what did they say? You just essentially make it look like you just plug it in and out comes a piece of software for Silicon on the other end. If any of you have ever built a web page and you've done a WYSIWYG translation, or anything like that, or ever tried to translate anything, or maybe you run WordPress, export your database, bring it in, everything doesn't translate. The code gets messy, and if you want to have good, clean code that's competitive in software going forward, it has to be written from the ground up to work in Silicon, or they're going to have to put a lot of work, manual work, into changing this. You can't just run it through an automatic thing, which will get it running, but what happens if you want to add a new feature? What happens if you want to do a bug fix? It can get very difficult. Maybe I'm wrong, but I talked to a friend of mine who works at Google. I'm not going to say who he is, that he told me back over the last transition, they were using Code Warrior to build an application that everybody knows and everyone on this channel uses. And he said that working with Xtools was like working with stone knives compared to Code Warrior. So that was back then. I'm sure Xtools is a lot better now. Xcode, is a lot better. That's the software that Apple uses, but there are other tools out there. So you're going to be able to translate the software forward. Now, here's the thing. When you're on an Intel machine, it doesn't matter. So there's two sides of this. Okay, so we're talking from this end. So you've got your Intel machine. Eventually, this thing is going to be a brick, or nothing is going to be supported anymore. That also asks the question for people clinging on desperately to CS6. I don't think CS6 is going to make the transition to Silicon, just so you know. I could be wrong, but I would be very surprised because Adobe's not developing it anymore, and they're going to be putting a lot of resources into the new Apple Silicon products. Okay, so that's one side. So we're on the Intel side, and we're, trying to keep all our software, so nothing's really changed except our hardware maybe is starting to get more obsolete. On the other side of it, you jump in and you buy one based on the new Mac Silicon. And by the way, they're coming out this week, not for consumers, but for developers. They've released a developer kit. So they have a Mac Mini that is running Apple Silicon right now, which is going into the hands of, I would imagine, thousands of developers around the world right now. So it's working. They said by the end of the year, the first Apple Silicon products will begin shipping. So that means they're going to be shipping Silicon and Intel products simultaneously. So this leaves a question, why would you buy an Intel-based product if you know there's a brick wall down there later on? Well, here's where it gets messy. The Intel machine is going to work perfectly until it doesn't anymore. Eventually, of course. Okay, let me make this simple. So if you're switching to Silicon, this is what you're going to be experiencing. Now you're going to have the latest hardware. You're going to have the software that's in Silicon, and it's going to be working hopefully really well. It's going to be looking probably a little bit different. It's going to be slick. You're going to be working nicely. And now your issue is, okay, what do I do with my old software that is not native yet? And that's the term we're going to be using, native, non-native. It's a very common term. Native is something that's built for that. Non-native is something that's being emulated or running through what they call Rosetta. Rosetta named after Rosetta Stone, the same as the translation software. A piece of stone they found helped them to translate hieroglyphics. So unlike the previous, and this is all based on what I've seen on the Apple keynote, unlike the previous Rosetta, this is actually going to translate So unlike the previous Rosetta, which was more real-time where it would run it through almost like a real-time emulator, it sounds like this is actually going to translate the software on installation. So that means when you install the software, Rosetta is going to do its thing, turn it into silicon, and then when you run it, it's going to be let's call it a migrated silicon. It's not going to be native. It's going to be migrated, which means it's not going to run quite as fast. There's probably some features that are not going to work. There's going to be some bugs, and there's going to definitely be some GUI things that are going to look a little bit differently. So you're definitely going to start jonesing for that new stuff. And I remember this, going through when they had, was it Classic? And then you were running Aqua, which was iOS 10, iOS X. And then you ran an old application that you hadn't bought or upgraded yet, or the developers hadn't updated it yet. And basically it ran an emulation of OS 9 and that would run on there. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be much more seamless and hopefully painless than that. But there are going to be teething problems. There are going to be incompatibility issues. These are just the things. So for the early adopters, they go into silicon. They've got a piece of hardware that's going to be future-proof, but they're going to go through maybe a couple of years of, who knows, it could be very smooth or it could be very rough sailing. We will see when time comes. Now, my advice is the first version of silicon is probably going to suck. I could be wrong. It could be like incredibly good, but usually, remember the first version of the new MacBook Pro? So they're going to learn some things along the way. So the first version, even if it doesn't suck, it's not going to be full potential. So, second version, they're definitely going to learn a lot. They're going to improve a lot, and it's going to be significantly better. So people that buy the first hardware, the next revs come out, they're going to be looking very jealously over the fence at the new hardware, wanting that. However, they're going to be having the new software. Okay, so I don't know if I'm helping you with all of this, but essentially, this is what we're heading into for the next couple of years. They say the next couple of years. I think it's going to be longer until this really ends, because this is really going to end the day that Apple and Adobe and everybody says, you know what, we're not going to support Intel anymore. This is the last operating version that does that. And then there'll be the promise of the bug fixes, which will happen for a short amount of time before everything is completely sunsetted. So what would I say to someone that wants to buy a new computer? I mean, I just bought a new Mac Pro, so the part of me is thinking, okay, there was a little bit of strategy here from Apple's part to try and make this a little bit easier. So here we've got some good news here. So think about the fact that Apple, when they went to Catalina, remember they stopped all 32-bit support and everything had to be 64-bit, which is why a lot of plugins, different things like that don't work anymore. And I was thinking to myself, okay, if they knew this was happening, why would they make us go through that transition? And then why would they release the new Mac Pro right before all of this, knowing that we just spent a lot of money on the Mac Pro? So let's start with the first one. My guess is this was planned so that everything could be starting with the minimum benchmark entry-level 64-bit. So there's no 32-bit applications going through there. Rosetta doesn't have to deal with any 32-bit applications in old code. So everything is going to be somewhat updated going in. So it was kind of a way to kind of whittle out some of that and make the jump a little bit more possible. Now for people holding on to older operating systems, holding on to older machines and older software, I guess you're just going to be trying to find Intel chips forever if you want to stay in the ecosystem. But Apple's going to continue building those for a while, so you'll be okay. So let's talk about that Mac Pro. So the Mac Pro is an expensive beast, as you know. And the good news about it is it's the first upgradable Mac that Apple's had in a long time. So in a perfect world, people with the Mac Pro starting maybe sometime next year, who knows, going to be able to pull it open, pull out that board with the CPU on it, and replace it with the new silicon CPU. And maybe it's taking advantage of external RAM, external storage, and also external GPU or video card. I could see that for the professional products because professionals need that. And the range of configurability that professionals need are very, very different than what consumers need. So let's go down to the consumer level. We're talking about things like Mac Pros. They're just going to go into silicon, and I think everything is going to be there. Memory, eventually anyway, CPU, GPU, memory, storage, all of that is going to be in one unit, kind of like it is in an iPad or an iPhone. And maybe broken into a couple, but I can see everything being kind of integrated, non-upgradable. So when you buy that MacBook or you buy that MacBook Pro, that's what you're getting. So maybe the Pro might use an additional GPU, such as the ATIs, for a little while longer. I think the writing is really on the wall for that. So the Pro machine is the only one I see that's going to stay upgradable. And that might only be for a certain amount of time, but we'll see there. So honestly, if I was going to buy a system and I didn't absolutely have to do it right now, I was just looking to upgrade. So my guess is by the end of the year, Apple's going to be coming out with that new hardware. So I would wait and see, because what we want is a couple of things we're looking at. One, my guess is the first one that's going to come out is going to be some kind of a MacBook Pro. And what we're interested in is, what's the performance like? How fast and efficiently does it run things? Of course, it's going to be screaming on video and Apple's native apps. We know that. We don't have to worry about it. But how fast is it going to run things like Adobe software, Microsoft, some of these other software that a lot of us use, 3D applications? How well is it going to work? And if it doesn't work natively, how well is Rosetta going to work with those applications? And we want to see, what is the power consumption like? What is the heat like? So if you can see a substantial increase in performance, all the applications that you want, that you need, are running nicely on that. And, and all these reports will come out, no chances are, I say I probably won't get one, but I probably will. And I'll probably be an early adopter, and I'll be testing it and letting you guys know what I discover. So wait for those tests to come out. And if you see the applications that you want are running better, more efficiently, then consider buying a new machine as a silicon machine. But also remember, when you buy that, you are going to have to deal with some things along the way. You're going to find little things that are not going to work, little applications and, things that maybe you used to use might not work quite the same or might not be available. But there'll be workarounds, and eventually that system will be better. Fast forward 5 years from now, this Apple Silicon machines are probably going to be absolutely amazing. Super fast, super power effective. They may even revolutionize the industry. Who knows? Who knows? We'll see. But then the other side of it, if you see that, they're buggy, they're having a lot of problems, they're not running fast, the performance is not there like expected, it could be time to say, I'm just going to buy another PC machine, an intermediate machine that's going to get me through the next 2 or 3 years, and just kind of knuckle down and work your way through that. So really, those are the choices you're going to have. Of course, you have the option to switch to Windows, which, a lot of people have done. Personally, I think there's going to be some remorse for people that do that, because I think the ride ahead for Apple, I think it's going to be fun. I think we're going to see some really cool, fast, amazing computers coming. Now, be prepared to pony up for them. I think it's going to be expensive. And remember that, we kind of been able to get around some of these things by buying our own RAM and different things like that. I see all those options shrinking, where Apple is definitely going to be pushing us into more of a proprietary system. So all the hardware you purchase is going to have to be purchased through Mac. Now, the other thing is security. That's another one of the cornerstones that they talked about. So as you know, there's a T2 security chip on a lot of machines. Well, if you know the new Mac Pro, you actually have to be able to hack that T2 security chip if you want to replace the startup hard drive, the SSD, with a different one. So I put an NVMe drive in there. I can't boot off that. I'd have to get through that T2 security chip in order to do that. So that security works two ways. What it does is it protects your machine from other people hacking into it, or if it gets stolen or lost, they can't access your data. There's definitely a nice thing about it, but the other side of it, it also allows Apple to control what hardware and what software you put on your system. So I do think, and I wouldn't put it past Apple to force you to buy all your software from the App Store. So eventually, unless there's some antitrust suit comes out, you'll have to buy all of your applications through the App Store that will be trusted, so they can, because they've already been pushing up that security in that area. And there have been kind of rumblings of that in some places, Europe, places like that, some antitrust stuff going on there, anti-competitive. So, yeah, so that's where we are. It is an exciting day. We've got a lot of decisions to make. And I don't think this transition is going to be as rough as the last transition. Because honestly, the transition from PowerPC to Intel wasn't that bad. There was definitely a lot of times, when I wished there was certain applications running natively, and then there was other times when I wished that I had the old versions of my applications. Because here's another thing. When we look at the Apple, their update process was slowed down incredibly. They were trying to build these new MacBook Pros, and some of these MacBook Pros were held up because they were waiting for Intel chips, or they had to release them on their release cycle and they didn't get the latest chip in. So there has been a lot of that where, it has been difficult for Apple to do what they want to do because they're trying to deal with Intel. And Apple only represents 3% of Intel's business. So as much as it's significant, I think it's in the vicinity of $3 billion a year, it's not that huge to someone like Intel who, they make chips, but they also have Internet of Things and a lot of other things where Intel make their money, enterprise and things like that is really where their big money is coming. So, we've got to kind of look at that. So Apple being untethered from there does give Apple the freedom to go forward and invent and innovate and do things that they've never done before. The new operating system might enable us to run Windows without having to use things like Parallels. But they also need that because if you know Boot Camp, well, of course, Boot Camp is probably not going to be a thing because we're not booting off an Intel chip. So it probably has to use that emulator to run those Windows applications. Maybe we'll still be using Parallels, VMware, but maybe that stuff is going to go away and that's going to be built in natively to Apple. So one thing I know for sure, it's definitely going to be a real shakeup for the system. It's going to shake up the hardware industry. It's going to shake up the software industry. And hopefully, us as consumers, creators, are going to be the better of it. So anyway, guys, I just wanted to give you my thoughts on all of this. Throw, my thoughts into the mix. I don't know if you agree or disagree with me. I'm just saying what I know. And also, I'm obviously got a lot of speculation. And what I'm saying here is a lot of things I don't know. And as time goes forward, some things will become clear, and some of the things I've said will be like, oh my God, he was right, and some of the things will be like, he was wrong. And that's what speculation is. So anyway, guys, I'd like to know your thoughts in the comments underneath. What do you think? What do you think is the future, and what are you going to do during this transition time? Are you going to be hanging on to Intel for a while? Are you going to be jumping to Silicon as soon as possible, or are you going to be kind of a wait and see? I think I'm going to be a wait and see, but knowing me, I'm probably going to do something and jump in early just because I can't help it. But I don't know. We'll see. So anyway, guys, if you are new here to Photoshop Cafe, welcome. Usually I give you Photoshop Lightroom tips and reviews. Like once a year or something, I'll have a rant like this where I just feel like we just want to have a conversation about something that's coming out that needs to be discussed. And if you want more videos like this, hit the subscribe button and turn on all the notifications. And anyway, guys, if you like this, smash the like button into dust. Until next time, I'll see you at the cafe.